Resident Evil Requiem has finally been revealed at this year's Summer Game Fest, and against all odds, Capcom actually did what I thought they wouldn't. They gave us a brand new protagonist. But before we get to RE9's Grace Ashcroft, let me take you back to where my doubts began in 2021. Okay, it's 2021. Everyone is still stuck indoors due to a real-life virus outbreak. Public discourse has spiraled into conspiracy theories and widespread distrust of the media. Meanwhile, a 90-year-old man has just been elected as President of the United States, and he's now expected to fix everything. Fast. Let's just say things aren't looking great. Between the massive layoffs that occurred during this time, people being more divided than ever socially and politically, having to use a mask in public anywhere we went to, well, there was a lot of worldwide unrest, to say the least. But hey, there was a new Resident Evil game in the horizon to save us from all our fears, and then it came out, and it was pretty good. Overall, Resident Evil Village was met with positive reviews from both journalists and fans. The game was heavily praised by the new gothic horror setting, Dimitrescu's polygon count, and an actual emotional story, which is kind of rare for a Resident Evil game. Other people noted that the game was focusing too much on the action elements, and it very often felt like a theme park ride. Well, although I mostly agree with all these points, there was something else that really stuck out to me like a sore thumb. And before we move on, here's a spoiler warning for Resident Evil Village, so if you haven't played it, please do before proceeding, thanks. By the end of the game, now-turned action hero Ethan Winters sacrifices himself to save his daughter Rose. It's a moving ending to his story, and it perfectly ends this character's arc. Maybe I'll go a little bit more in depth in a future video, but I really like Ethan Winters, and his journey is definitely a good one. Then there's the classic plot twist that is meant to be a cliffhanger that never goes anywhere in these games, and the game ends, or so I thought. After the credits roll, a post-credit scene starts playing, in which an older Rose Winters, Ethan's daughter, is visiting her father's grave. One of the doofuses that is keeping an eye on her calls her Evelyn, the name of the villain from Mario 7 and 8, because why not, sounds like a great idea. And she says this:
I can show you things even Chris doesn't know I can do.
Now, we later had a DLC called Shadows of Rose, which actually resolved her story, albeit in a very, well, kinda Devil May Cry way, I think. But this only came out a year later, so in the meantime, my reaction to this ending was what? What the fuck? My fear was that the next mainline Resident Evil game would feature a protagonist with powers, which I'm not a huge fan of. In my last video, I explained what makes Resident Evil so compelling. At first you play as someone who is either not a fighter or has combat training, but is placed in a situation they weren't ready for, and by the end, you become an ultimate badass. This character arc is satisfying because it gives the player a well-deserved power trip after being scared stiff through most of the game, and it actually makes the player resonate with the protagonist. Now you can say that we've had some protagonists with powers before. For example, Jake had powers. Well, yeah, he did, in arguably the worst mainline Resident Evil game in the series. I guess Ethan had powers, but his powers were just not to fall apart. He's still just getting by during the entire game, and that's what makes it work in his case. Even with powers, Ethan still feels way weaker than any of the legacy characters. So where could Capcom take the franchise next? Well, worst case scenario, I feared RE9 would take a Bioshock style approach and give Rose some limited powers, but the idea just rubbed me the wrong way at the time. Capcom could either go this path or use one of the legacy characters for the next title entry, like the leaks first suggested. But this raised another problem. By this point, every legacy character, probably with the exception of Rebecca, are bona fide superheroes. Jill would probably still work wonderfully, since she hasn't had a fraction of Chris's Leon's spotlight, but at this point it seems Capcom has no interest in using Jill, so it just seemed unlikely. There was always a third option, And this is what I always thought Capcom should but wouldn't do. To create a new character, like they did with Ethan Winters in RE7. The fact is that for Resident Evil to be scary, we need to have a less experienced protagonist to channel the fear to the player. This worked wonderfully in the first titles, but as I've stated before, a character can only go through the action hero arc so many times until they become Arnold Schwarzenegger in Commando. Just doesn't make sense to use them in that way anymore. But seeing as Resident Evil 3 Remake, Village, and 4 Remake were getting closer and closer to full-on action again, this seemed like the unfortunate path they were headed to. Now with that out of the way, let's talk about what actually happened, and discuss the new protagonist of RE9, Grace Ashcroft. To my absolute shock, Resident Evil Requiem actually makes my highest expectations come true. For this entry, directed by the same man who directed RE7, Capcom created a brand new protagonist. No powers, no special suplex moves, and no boulder punching. Just a normal human being with some combat training. I just couldn't believe it. Grace Ashcroft is an FBI intelligence analyst. She is resourceful and has great deduction skills, but isn't heavily trained in combat as the legacy characters. She's an introvert who isolates herself in her work, and from the trailer it seems that she's socially awkward in a very likable kind of way. The developers have said that her story is deeply personal, as she goes through a big transformation throughout the game. Honestly, everything about this description is just green flags for me. First of all, the fact that she works for the FBI. I'm a huge fan of, let's say, procedural horror. What I mean by this are stories where generally an FBI agent or detective is assigned to a strange case, usually involving a serial killer. These stories usually start grounded, but as each new clue is uncovered, the protagonist finds themselves spiraling into much darker territory. I'm talking about Twin Peaks, Silence of the Lambs, Longlegs, Seven, etc. A video game example of this could be Condemned Criminal Origins, which is probably the best game to adapt procedural horror in my opinion. While it doesn't seem like this is going to reflect much in the game's mechanics, other than things we've already seen in other games, like being able to inspect items and solve puzzles, I think this is a great trope to take Resident Evil in, and is one of the few genres of horror RE hasn't quite dipped its toes in yet. From the trailer we also get some visuals that resemble something from the 2000s, let's say Saw for example, which is very much procedural horror as well. So they are definitely trying to capture this tone, and I'm absolutely over the moon by it. Another important detail is that Grace is also actually related to Alyssa Ashcroft, a character from the 2003 online co-op spin-off Resident Evil Outbreak. This is honestly pretty genius, since it gives Grace a connection to Raccoon City, which we are returning to after almost 30 years, while at the same time feeling fresh, like passing down the torch to a new generation of RE protagonists. This gives context to her involvement in the game's story, while also paying tribute to the work done previously by the developers. Something I also like is that by making her an FBI agent, it means that every core Resident Evil mechanic can be used in a very balanced way. Like I've mentioned before, she will inspect objects and solve puzzles, but with her limited combat training, although she may start by using regular handguns at first, I can assume that by the end, she'll be more than ready to use the iconic rocket launcher or its respective counterpart in the game. It's honestly a pretty genius concept, and I'm ashamed I didn't originally trust Capcom to deliver it. Even though we have our new protagonist, it is also said that Leon is going to make an appearance as well, but this hasn't been officially confirmed though. Honestly, since we already have our perfect main protagonist, I don't mind much if Leon appears in some sequences to let the player kick some ass. It doesn't ruin Grace's arc in any way, and it gives the player moments to be an action hero sooner than the third act of the game. If balanced correctly, this can work wonderfully and keep the pacing interesting. In that way, we will still have that satisfying classic RE formula with Grace, while also having moments of pure adrenaline and balls-to-the-wall action with Leon, which will most likely serve as a send-off to him. It's a new formula and I'm all here for it. So it seems that once again, Capcom have managed to impress me. At the Resident Evil Village, I was honestly pretty scared that Capcom were going to lean more heavily towards the action genre, or that our next protagonist would be Rose with Bioshock-like powers. But no, the developers are giving us exactly what I dreamt the future of this series would be, and I'm beyond excited to play a Resident Evil game with a new protagonist in Grace Ashcroft. I just can't wait for February 27th.